My name is Laurel, and I was 31 years old when my husband of 8 years slid a manila envelope across our kitchen island like he was handing me a utility bill. Inside were divorce papers. Behind him, standing in the doorway to my own kitchen in a silk blouse I'd never seen before, was his assistant. I remember the specific smell of the coffee I'd just brewed. I remember the way the morning light hit the granite countertop. I remember thinking, this can't be happening right now. Because 20 minutes earlier, I had been on the phone with our fertility clinic confirming our 4th IUI cycle, 4 attempts, 8 years. And he had already decided he was done. Laurel, he said my name like he was trying to explain something obvious to someone slow. This has been over for a long time. You know that. I didn't speak. I looked at his assistant, a 24-year-old named Tessa who I had personally recommended he hire 2 years ago because she seemed organized and sharp, and I watched her look at the floor. She's pregnant, my husband said. I need you to understand that this isn't negotiable. I'm a hospital administrator. I had spent 8 years managing a department of 200 people, budgeting millions of dollars, navigating union contracts and insurance disputes and families in crisis. I had also spent those same 8 years tracking my basal body temperature every morning, swallowing fistfuls of supplements, sitting in paper gowns in waiting rooms that smelled like recycled air while doctors explained to me, gently, patiently, why my body kept failing at the one thing I wanted most. And now I was standing in my own kitchen being told by my husband, an orthopedic surgeon with a god complex I'd mistaken for confidence, that his pregnant 24-year-old assistant needed him more than I did. I picked up the manila envelope, I set it back down, then I said very quietly, "Get her out of my house." He blinked. "Laurel, get her out, right now, or I will." Tessa left. My husband stayed, and what followed was 45 minutes of the most methodical dismantling of a person I have ever experienced. He told me the fertility problems were exhausting. He told me I had become unavailable. He told me I had turned our marriage into a clinical project. He said these things with the calm authority of a man who had clearly rehearsed them. And I sat at my own kitchen island and listened because somewhere in the back of my mind I kept thinking, if I stay still enough, I'll figure out the right thing to say to make this not real. There was no right thing to say. By the end of October, I was living in a 2-bedroom apartment in a part of town I didn't know well, driving a car that was 3 years older than the one I'd traded in during the divorce settlement, eating cereal for dinner because I couldn't make myself cook for one. My sister-in-law, his sister, Sandra, who I had genuinely loved for 8 years, stopped returning my calls within a week of him filing. My mother-in-law sent me a text that said, "Wishing you all the best going forward," and I never heard from her again. The friends we'd had as a couple divided themselves with the efficiency of a corporate merger. Most of them went with him. A few checked in for a month or two, and then got busy with their own lives, which I understood and also couldn't forgive, not yet. I was alone in a way I had never been as an adult. The apartment complex was a quiet, low-key place on the east side, mostly young professionals and a few retirees. My unit was on the ground floor, which I hated, with a small patio that looked out onto a shared courtyard. The unit next to mine had been empty when I moved in. In early December, someone moved in. I didn't pay much attention at first. I heard the moving truck. I heard the sound of boxes being stacked. A few days later, I found a note in my mailbox that had been misdirected, addressed to N. Calloway, Unit 4B. I walked it over and knocked. The man who answered was somewhere in his mid-40s with the kind of face that looked like it had seen a significant amount of weather, not handsome in any obvious way. Quiet eyes. He was holding a wrench. "I think this is yours," I said, handing him the envelope. "Thanks." He looked at it, then back at me. "You just move in?" "October," I said. "November for me," he said. "Nathan Laurel." We stood there for a moment in the particular awkwardness of two adults who have both clearly downsized recently and don't want to explain why. "Coffee maker's still packed," he said. "If you've got a working one, I'd owe you a cup." I did have a working coffee maker. That was how we became whatever we became. Slowly, through shared coffee and borrowed Wi-Fi passwords, and the occasional knock on the wall that meant, "Do you want to watch whatever's on?" because neither of us could sleep. I found out gradually that Nathan had been a federal agent for 19 years. Not active anymore, he'd left the bureau 8 months prior, after what he described only as a situation I wasn't willing to keep being part of. He was quiet about the details and I didn't push. What I noticed was that he was precise in everything he did, almost unnervingly so, but also patient in a way that felt earned rather than performed. He never asked me about the fertility stuff. He never made comments about my age or my timeline or what I should be doing next. He asked about my work. He listened when I talked about hospital budget cycles with genuine interest, or at least convincing approximation of it. And when I told him once, only once, that I had spent 8 years trying to have a child and that chapter of my life was probably closed, he said simply, "That's a lot to carry. Not I'm sorry. Not you still have time. Just, that's a lot to carry." I cried after he left, exactly, more like something that had been held very tightly finally having a little room. In January, I got a call from my attorney. My ex-husband's legal team was contesting the division of a retirement account we'd opened jointly in 2019. He claimed the majority of contributions had come from his income. This was technically true and also completely beside the point, legally speaking, but his attorney was aggressive and the process dragged on for 2 additional months that cost me money I didn't have to spare. What I didn't know in January, what I had no way of knowing, was that Tessa had already started showing cracks. I heard this through a mutual friend, Dana, who worked at the hospital in a different department and had stayed genuinely neutral through the divorce. She told me in March, over lunch, that Tessa had apparently been having significant anxiety about the pregnancy, that she had gone to my ex-husband's mother with concerns, that his mother, the same woman who had sent me a wishing you well text, had been quietly trying to manage the situation because the baby's paternity had become, in Dana's delicate phrasing, a point of discussion. I didn't know what to do with that information, so I filed it away and kept going. I was good at keeping going. It was possibly my least useful superpower. February brought the kind of cold that makes you question your life choices on a cellular level. Nathan had started leaving coffee ready for me. On mornings, he knew I had early shifts. He'd figured out my schedule without me telling him, which should have been either comforting or alarming and was somehow both. I was starting to understand that there was nothing casual about the way he paid attention to things. One evening I came home from a 12-hour shift to find a note on my door. "Pipes in 4B are frozen. Plumber can't come until tomorrow. I'm at the diner on Clement if you want dinner that doesn't involve a microwave." Signed with just his initial, I went. I was still in my work clothes. I didn't care. We sat in a corner booth for 3 hours. He told me about growing up in eastern Tennessee, about joining the FBI at 26 because he'd wanted to believe that systems of justice could actually function, about the slow erosion of that belief over 2 decades of watching good cases fail for bureaucratic reasons, and watching people with money escape consequences that would have buried anyone without it. He told me about his ex-wife, briefly. 7 years, no children, ended because, in his words, I was married to the job and she was right to stop waiting. I told him about the first IUI, about sitting in the car afterward and calling my husband to tell him it hadn't worked, and hearing him say okay and then immediately pivot to asking if I could pick up dry cleaning. I'd never told anyone that story. I hadn't realized I was carrying it until I put it down. "He treated it like a problem you were having," Nathan said. "Yes," I said, "exactly that." We drove home separately. He walked me to my door. Nothing happened, but something had shifted and we both knew it and neither of us said anything about it, which was the right call. In April, 2 things happened within the same week. The first, my ex-husband's attorney finally settled the retirement account dispute in a way that was, while not what I'd hoped for, at least finished. 8 months of marriage had officially been dismantled into its component parts and distributed. I drove home from signing the final paperwork and sat in my car in the apartment parking lot for a while, not feeling what I expected to feel. The second, I was late. I assumed stress. I had been under significant stress for 7 months. My cycles had been irregular before, during, and throughout the fertility treatments. The idea that I could be pregnant was so far outside the available probability space that I genuinely did not consider it until the 3rd day. I bought a test at a pharmacy 3 towns over, because I am apparently the kind of person who does that, and I took it in the apartment bathroom with the fan running and the door locked even though I lived alone. Positive. I stood there for a long time, long enough that the fan started to sound like white noise and then like static and then like nothing at all. I took 3 more tests over the next 2 days, all positive. I called my OB on a Thursday morning. They had me come in Friday. The ultrasound technician was quiet for a moment longer than I was comfortable with, and then she turned the screen toward me and said, "I'm seeing two heartbeats, 2 separate sacs." I had spent 8 years being told in increasingly clinical language that my body was uncooperative. I had done everything right: the timing, the monitoring, the injections, the procedures, and nothing had worked. And here, in a year where I had done nothing at all except survive, my body had apparently decided to do this entirely on its own. I sat in the parking lot of the OB's office for 40 minutes before I could drive. I didn't tell Nathan that day, or the next. I needed to sit with it by myself first, which is probably a character flaw but is also just who I am. I told him on a Sunday. He'd made breakfast, he cooked better than he let on, and we were sitting on his small patio with the door open and the late April air coming through. I told him everything: the fertility history, the failed cycles, the way my ex-husband had treated logistics and then what the ultrasound had shown on Friday. Nathan was quiet for a long moment. "Twins," he said. "Twins." Another pause. "How are you?" Not "what are you going to do?" Not "is it mine?" Though he knew perfectly well the timeline, we both did. Not any of the questions I'd been dreading. Just, "How are you?" "Terrified," I said. "And also, I don't have a word for the other thing." "Grateful," he offered. "Maybe, something like that." He reached across the table and put his hand over mine. We stayed like that for a while. My ex-husband found out in May. I didn't tell him. Dana told me later that Tessa had mentioned it to someone at his clinic. She and my ex were apparently navigating their own complications by then. Something to do with paternity questions that had progressed from a point of discussion to an actual DNA test. And the news that his infertile ex-wife was pregnant with twins had made its way to him through the specific cruelty of medical community gossip. Dana said he'd gone pale when he heard. She'd been there. She described it as watching someone realize all at once that the story they'd been telling themselves had a significant factual error at its center. I did not feel satisfaction about this, exactly. What I felt was something quieter, a settling, like a long-held breath finally released. What happened next came out over the following weeks in pieces. The DNA test had confirmed that Tessa's baby was not my ex-husband's child. She had been involved with someone else during the same period. A fact she had apparently not disclosed because, from what Dana carefully did not quite say, the financial security of being pregnant by a successful orthopedic surgeon had seemed like a better option than the alternative. His mother, who had texted me wishing you all the best going forward 8 months prior, reportedly did not take this well. The family had already started restructuring around the expectation of a grandchild. There had apparently been discussions about upgrading to a larger house in a better school district. Plans had been made. I am not a vindictive person, I want to be clear about that, but I will not pretend that hearing this information felt like nothing. Nathan had contacts. 19 years in federal law enforcement leaves a significant network, and when I told him quietly that Tessa had also taken several pieces of jewelry from our shared home during the move-out period the previous October, pieces that had belonged to my grandmother, pieces I had specifically documented with photographs as part of the divorce asset inventory, he made 2 phone calls. I don't know exactly what those calls contained. What I know is that 3 weeks later, my attorney received notification that a civil judgment had been filed in my favor regarding the missing items, and that Tessa had agreed to return the jewelry in lieu of a criminal theft charge. My grandmother's ring came back to me on a Wednesday in June. I put it on and wore it for the rest of the day without taking it off. By July, I had moved out of the apartment, not because things hadn't worked out with Nathan, but because they had, and the ground floor unit with the patio that looked onto the courtyard had started to feel like a transition space that we'd both outgrown. We found a house with enough room, in a neighborhood with good schools, which was a sentence I had stopped allowing myself to think and had somehow ended up thinking anyway. Nathan had been offered a position consulting for a task force that investigated financial crimes. The kind of case, he said, where people with money thought they were invisible. He took it. He was careful and thorough and believed, still, despite everything, that accountability was possible. I had decided to love him partly for that. I went back to work full-time through early August and then stepped back to part-time by arrangement with my department head, who was a practical woman named Gloria who had been through 2 pregnancies of her own and simply said, "We'll figure it out." We did figure it out. The twins were born on a Thursday in October, exactly 1 year, almost to the week, after I had moved into that apartment with a suitcase and a coffee maker and no clear idea of what came next. A boy and a girl, both healthy, both loud, both immediately and completely themselves. My ex-husband sent a text message that I did not see until 2 days after they were born. It said, "Heard the news. Congrats." I stared at it for a moment. Then I put my phone face down on the bedside table and went back to sleep. There is something I want to say about the 8 years, because I think it matters. I blamed myself for all of it. Not just the fertility failures, though I blamed myself for those too, even knowing intellectually that blame was medically meaningless, but for the marriage. For choosing someone who treated my pain like an inconvenience, for staying, for the years I spent trying to fix something that wasn't broken by me and couldn't be repaired by me, because the person on the other side of it had already left long before he handed me that envelope in the kitchen. I was not the problem. I understand that now in a way I didn't for a long time. My body was not the problem either. It just needed different conditions, less cortisol, less monitoring, less of someone standing in the doorway of my own kitchen with a look that said you have already failed. Nathan came in from outside one evening when the twins were about 6 weeks old. He'd been doing something in the garage. He was still in his jacket. He looked at me sitting on the floor of the living room with both of them, which is where I spent a significant portion of my time that fall, and he just stopped in the doorway and looked for a moment. "What?" I said. "Nothing," he said. "Just." He took his jacket off and came and sat on the floor with us. "This is a good thing." That is the whole sentence. That is all he said. And he was absolutely, completely right. I am not the woman who used to track her temperature every morning before she was allowed to have hope. I am not the woman my ex-husband dismissed as unavailable. I am Laurel, and I am 32 years old, and I am sitting on the floor of a house I chose, with 2 people I made without trying, next to a man who asked how are you when he meant it, and the answer finally, for the first time in longer than I can remember is, good. I am doing good.